Batman Arkham City was Rocksteady's follow-up to Batman Arkham Asylum, which was a successful Metroidvania game that came out, partially riding the hype of Christopher Nolan's trilogy, but saw some returning cast members from the popular Batman the Animated Series TV show, with the return of Mark Hamill's Joker, and of course Kevin Conroy's Batman, and ended up becoming its own beast. This game would see the concept of that game go to a new level, with Rocksteady hoping to expand from an island with a few Metroidvania-style zones to an expansive city that took over a solid portion of Gotham, and much like the first game, Batman finding himself in the middle of a multi-villain conspiracy. Again orchestrated by Joker, but this time Hugo Strange was there as well, with many other characters also having schemes of their own, such as Two-Face, Mr. Freeze, and Talia al Ghul. Of course, as I've said in a lot of my videos, I've been a huge comic fan for a long time now, and was actively reading Batman comics at the time of this game's release, and while I like the Nolan films, the allure of a more comic-accurate Batman that you could play as definitely stood out to me, and the "you get to be Batman" hype definitely had me wrapped up, and I got this game day one. And since then, I've moved on to own multiple ports. I own this game on PC as a disc, on Steam, Xbox 360, Standard, and Game of the Year, and the Return to Arkham version for Xbox One, which is cross-compatible. Not to mention, I have a PS3 copy for good measure. However, you can get this game on PS4, Nintendo Switch, and yes, you can get it on Wii U as well if you feel so inclined. I decided to play this playthrough on my Xbox One X since I have a disc copy, and will be playing the enhanced Return to Arkham port, which saw updated textures and the like. Standard cross-gen port stuff. This is the ideal version of the game to get, since you also get the DLC packed in. I also grabbed a bit of footage of the Xbox 360 game on the Game of the Year edition, which, to be honest, between being a bit drunk, a bit tired, and a bit rusty, and used to Spider-Man controls, didn't go as well as I would hope. Regardless of skill, I mostly got these to compare the graphics, so here's the original. And here's Return to Arkham.
Robin plays more like Batman. That's why I don't like playing Nightwing.
Both look pretty good, but it's nice to have the updated textures for the newer consoles to help these games keep up with the graphically impressive, to this day, Arkham Knight at the end of this trilogy. Batman Arkham City released a bit more than 2 years after Arkham Asylum, coming out in October 2011 compared to Arkham Asylum's August 2009, and to release a game this big, impressive, and polished in that time is nothing short of a miracle, and in that time, even back then, it was a pretty impressive feat that the developers pulled off. Development started during the production of Arkham Asylum. In Arkham Asylum, you can see the Warden's office has a blueprint for Arkham City, the goal being to keep the densely packed, detail-filled world, but expand it to a large open-world setting. The developers omitted the Batmobile from this game, with the gliding seeming sufficient, and being that Arkham City was so dilapidated by design, it would be very hard to add vehicles to it, though they definitely changed this philosophy when they ended up making the third game in the trilogy, which is almost entirely a Batmobile game. The game expanded gadgets and added advanced gliding mechanics to help make a new traversal method, and to not make it a pain to go place to place, like it would be if you had to hike it like you did with the much smaller Arkham Asylum game. This game would also add more playable characters, with Robin, Nightwing, and Catwoman being added as playable characters in the roster, though only Catwoman is playable in the main story, and Robin is playable in an expansion. Nightwing is exclusive to Challenge Mode, and Joker, who is exclusive to the PS3 port of Arkham Asylum and later the remaster, would not be returning as a playable character in this game, however. A 5-issue miniseries would be developed by the game's writer Paul Dini to link Arkham Asylum and Arkham City, so if you want to check out that comic, it's available somewhere. Probably on Comixology, or you can find a cheap trade paperback. Game tie-ins usually aren't that expensive. The story of Arkham City takes place after the Joker's takeover of Arkham Asylum during the events of the previous game. Politicians in Gotham, led by Hugo Strange, managed to cut off a section of Gotham and make it a prison for the many inmates, with Hugo in control and the city essentially under martial law. Bruce Wayne is brought in as a political prisoner to Arkham City, but quickly changes into Batman to see what's going on behind its walls. Hugo confesses he knows who the Batman is, and he's soon going to commence the upcoming Protocol 10. Batman once again meets numerous villains, but the main villain, as you may expect, is Joker, who is dying due to the Titan formula he took in the previous game. Joker manages to capture Batman, giving the pair a blood transfusion to slowly kill his enemy in the same way that he's dying, in one last plot for vengeance over Batman. Batman learns Mr. Freeze is a cure, but the issue is he has to convince Freeze to help him and save him from the Penguin who has him imprisoned in the Iceberg Lounge. Batman saves Freeze, who of course turns on him. After Freeze's defeat, Batman has the cure, though due to its instability, it's not super effective, so Batman needs something to stabilize it. Thankfully for Batman, Ra's al Ghul has seemingly been around Arkham City since he's seen his ninjas, and Raz's Lazarus Pit blood that revives him could probably stabilize the cure. So Batman heads to the old Gotham Underground, where he intends to confront Ra's for his help, but as always, Ra's and his daughter Talia want to cause issues for the Caped Crusader. The group fight, since Batman won't be Raz's successor, and Batman manages to get the blood, which Freeze synthesizes into a cure. However, Harley Quinn steals the antidote, leading Batman to confront Joker and Harley. Joker appears to be cured, and Talia arrives to help Batman out, but Protocol 10 is activated by Strange, and in the confusion, Joker captures Talia and escapes. Batman ended up infiltrating Wonder Tower, which is where Hugo Strange was hiding out, though the tower also features Ra's al Ghul, who kills Hugo, and as it turns out, it was him pulling the strings the whole time. Ra's falls off the tower and dies, and the tower is destroyed after Hugo Strange, with his dying breaths, activated Protocol 11, which blew up the tower with him and Ra's in it. With the day being saved, Batman heads back to save Talia and confront the Joker, but Joker kills Talia. However, this wasn't truly Joker, rather Clayface in disguise. Batman takes out Clayface and uses the antidote before covering the Lazarus Pit, making it unusable for the Joker. Batman is about to cure Joker, but Joker attacks him and the antidote is destroyed. With no way to save the Joker now, the villain dies, with Batman admitting he would have saved him despite all he's done, and thus the main story ends. Other side stories include Catwoman's, which was initially DLC for the game but was added into the game for later releases. She's in Arkham and is captured by Two-Face, who attempts to kill her to prove his ruthlessness, though this is the first villain Batman stops. Catwoman hopes to steal some loot from Arkham City, but during Protocol 10, she sees a beat-down unconscious Batman and helps him recover, and then eventually leaves Arkham City. Riddler, who, much like Arkham Asylum, hides Riddler collectibles and now additional puzzles around Arkham for Batman to find. Azrael attempts to prove to Batman that he will one day be worthy of his cowl. Zsasz returns with hostages to threaten Batman, who needs to safely rescue them from the crazed serial killer. Bane returns as well and needs Batman's help to find some stolen Venom formula, which of course leads to Bane turning on him in a fight. Deadshot shows up and is assassinating political prisoners. Eventually, Batman catches on and saves Deadshot's last target, Jack Ryder, before he can kill him, ultimately leading to the duo fighting. Hush is here and he crafts his identities to look like Bruce Wayne, committing a series of murders throughout Gotham in the process to craft his new identity. Finally, we had the Mad Hatter, who hypnotizes Batman and leads him on a pretty cool Mad Hatter fight sequence. So as you can see, beyond the main villains, Joker, Harley, Hugo Strange, Ra's al Ghul, and Talia, several other rogues have little side missions and other happenings during the events of Arkham City. This also makes the city feel a little more lively than if it was just an empty hub with standard game missions in between long stretches of traversal. The city in Arkham City is pretty nice looking. It definitely isn't huge, being pretty quick to traverse even without fast travel, but much like Arkham Asylum, the game didn't want to feel super modern and futuristic. Rather, it looks old and dilapidated, with plenty of unique buildings and old buildings for Batman to traverse and explore, which I think works well for this almost apocalyptic world Batman finds himself in. Also makes it a bit easier for the game to forgo the standard pains of a massive open world. There are also some fun story exclusive areas like Wonder Tower and Wonder City, underground before that sort of have early 20th century World's Fair vibes, which I thought was pretty fun. Though the game has several collectibles and side missions to fill your time during and after the game, the story is still very tight and the objective markers are very point A to point B, with me not getting lost too much trying to traverse this world. You can also find random street encounters encounters or stealth encounters, which will add XP you can use to buff Batman or Catwoman. The buffing system is pretty fair and not too in-depth. You'll be pretty powered up by the time you finish the main campaign, even if you're kind of ignoring side missions at first. If you want, you can do min-maxing, start with higher health buffs, or you can upgrade your combat and ballistic armor pretty quickly, which is helpful, especially for new players or people that are not too good like myself. Or you can just go for cool swaggy combat and combo moves, which can help more experienced players do cool stuff. These combo and special moves help with combat along with tech upgrades, which can make your technology better for combat or just make them more useful for in-mission use or for side missions. The upgrade tree is easy to read and isn't too daunting for players to traverse as some upgrade trees can be. Combat has sped up a bit from the last game, with Batman being a little more jumpy than before. You kind of jerk around the stage instead of having to position yourself as much. You also sometimes have 2 or 3 enemies run at you at once, which is something you can now counter with a single press of the Y button, and it usually does kind of a cool animation. Bosses vary like before, but with less Venom-based bosses, I think the variety is fun. Mr. Freeze, for example, is a stealth boss, Clayface is a bunch of physical and ranged moves, Ra's al Ghul is an epic climax-esque boss. It's all really cool. Gadgets have a variety of uses. Some are buffed from the last game, but things like the grappling hook are now a tad weaker since it can no longer just hug enemies down railings, which was really busted for stealth in the first game, as I probably mentioned in my first video like 4 years ago. One thing I really appreciated is now you can get hits off batarangs, which is helpful if you find space between you and enemies, and can cause a free knockdown or even knockout for enemies you've already beat down a little bit. The freeze grenade can freeze enemies for a long time, and especially when you have 2 gunners side by side, can give you a good tactical advantage. The gadgets are nice, and you start out with many of them, so you can play around with them from the start of the game. The ones you unlock, like the freeze grenade, are well tutorialized for gameplay use and show up a lot in their early missions. Arkham City, as I said, has 4 playable characters, those being Batman, Robin, Nightwing, and Catwoman. All but Nightwing are playable within the campaign, as I said, despite Robin being DLC exclusive. Nowadays, Catwoman's just built into the game, though when the game first came out, it was a free code packed in the box. It was more of a 2011 punishment for buying the game used, as was the norm back then when publishers were trying to discourage the purchase of used games. Batman is who you'll likely play as the most though, assuming you don't get really into the challenge mode. Batman plays much the same in combat. As I said, he's the strongest and has the most health, ostensibly being the tank of the 4 characters. The combat is definitely timed around Batman, so he'll be the easiest for you to get used to off the bat. No pun intended there. Catwoman is the weakest and the most fragile, but is extra jumpy and fast. I find at times her counter timing doesn't work quite as well as you would hope, and once you miss one, it can sometimes lead to you taking more hits, with each hit really costing you when she gets beat down very quick and has a longer stun time than someone like Batman. She has a whip and these things that can tie up enemies for a bit, but honestly, I don't love her gadgets and she has far less options than Batman. Robin plays more like Batman. He's definitely a bit quicker than Batman, but not too fast. He uses his trademark pull, which is cool, and he hits hard and pretty quick. Robin also has a bullet shield, which can occasionally come in handy, and shurikens in lieu of batarangs. Robin is probably my second favorite to play under Batman. Finally, we have Nightwing, who's pretty similar to Catwoman, fast but a bit of a glass cannon with awkward counter timing. He has the Eskrima sticks that are kind of cool, and they'll occasionally electrocute enemies, all of the electrical enemies from the game, which will put them in stun for a second and allow you to get some beatdowns. There are a few types of enemies in this game. You have standard enemies that can punch, kick, etc., and they can be armed with knives, which will have them come in and do 3 slicing attacks trying to hit the player. Later in the game, you can get an upgrade that'll allow you to instant knockout if you do perfect dodges on all 3 of these attacks. Electric taser sticks, which the player will navigate by jumping over the enemy by double tapping A and then hitting them from behind. Shield enemies who you have to use a stun move on, then double tap A to do a tackle on. And gun enemies who will occasionally show up in combat encounters, though they're mostly for stealth encounters, which itself has some accessories like jammers, night visions, and speakers that will alert other characters characters to them if you've knocked them out. You also have armored enemies. You need to stun, then hit a bunch with rapid attacks, which will knock them out. Mr. Hammer and Sickle are here, and they're buff giants that have charge attacks, swing attacks, and will sometimes throw enemies at you. They're taken out by using a stun, then rapid attacking them, which is sometimes a bit tricky if a bunch of enemies are around, but are satisfying to beat up. Finally, we got the bosses with various gimmicks, as I mentioned before, and some one-offs like robots that attack like standard enemies, but take tons of hits, and Talia's ninjas, which will swing at you basically like knife enemies, but with 5 attacks, but are a little weaker. So there's a good variety of enemies here. This game looks pretty solid for being 13 years old, and the fact that it's 13 years old makes me feel very old. It is occasionally a bit swampy, even though the version I played is the upgraded facelifted Return to Arkham version. I honestly never liked the look quite as much as the first. There's lots of stuff here and everything's super dark, which makes things just kind of blend in my eye a little bit and look a bit like a giant mush. Though the draw distance is good and the city's textures are nice on their own, and there are some really nice looking exceptions like Wonder City, which I thought looked awesome, though the overall openness of actual levels in the story aren't really that much bigger than the first game. And I kind of liked the locations in the first game a little bit better. Arkham Asylum was dense and original end to end, and while I think that's true of Arkham City, perhaps flying over the city rather than walking around these labyrinth-like streets make me kind of miss the overworld of that first game, since I feel like I missed so much just gliding over everything. And I'm guessing this is an unpopular opinion, but I think it's part of the growing pains of going from a 3D Metroidvania to a 3D open world game. They are similar in a lot of ways, and the gameplay hasn't changed a ton, but with very different presentation, which, as we'll eventually get to, was expanded upon further in Arkham Knight, though that's a far way away. We have a lot to talk about before we get to Arkham Knight. Tonally, the game fits in with the first game. The game isn't afraid to kill off characters, make things look hopeless, and tasking players with playing as Batman, potentially facing his death if he doesn't soon find a solution to the predicament that he found himself in following his blood transfusion with the Joker. I really like the tone, and I think the story also works really well as an expansion, especially on the Batman and Joker dynamic from the first game in the series, and I also think Batman, Ra's al Ghul, and Talia have a pretty interesting dynamic as well, so seeing those three interact in a video game is pretty fun. Musically, the game goes pretty ambient with the score that stretches throughout the game. The music was done by Nick Andel and Ron Fish. Some people may not know this, but the game also had an original soundtrack inspired by the game. It most notably features Panic at the Disco, but also a bunch of other bands I've never heard of. Most of the album is now delisted from Apple Music, so that's a bit odd, but Warner Music being a huge subsidiary of Warner Bros. Means cross-promotions like this aren't all that uncommon. This game decided to add a lot of suits, which is something that people definitely wanted and made a fun variety for the game. Now this is very much the standard, but during Arkham Asylum, suits were clearly an afterthought since that game just had the main suit and the armored Batman suit. This game outfits each of its 4 characters with a few different suits, so I'll briefly talk about each. Arkham City is the default suit and doesn't really change a lot from the base suit from Arkham Asylum, though the suit does start to get beat up as the game goes on. It's a nice suit, and it's kind of Batman's iconic video game suit at this point. Mad Hatter Batman is an alternative skin you can't unlock but is used during the Mad Hatter segment, Mad Hatter's Most Wanted mission. It's a deranged look based around the standard suit. Pretty neat. Armored Batsuit is a gimmick suit exclusive to the Wii U version that would eventually be added to the fairly recent Nintendo Switch port of the game as well. Why this is locked to the Wii U version, I'm not sure, but it's worth noting Batman wears this suit throughout the Wii U version of the game rather than his standard Batsuit. I'm really not sure why. A lot of these suits were originally locked behind pre-order bonuses, but later came out in a skin pack. For example, the 1970s Batsuit, which was exclusive to the now defunct Toys R Us, which is the standard 1970s looking Batsuit that would most famously be illustrated by people like Neil Adams. The Batman Beyond suit was based based on Batman Beyond, but was obviously a bit bulkier than the suit from that show since Terry is much smaller than Bruce, but it's a cool suit for sure, a great design, and since the game shares so much DNA with the DC AU, it seems right to have this be playable. Speaking of Batman the Animated Series, the series also has a skin which is startlingly accurate and a bit creepy, but it's cool to have this suit for the game since Kevin Conroy is back in the metaphorical cowl as the voice of Batman, so it's nice kind of playing into his roots a bit. Batman Earth 1 skin is based off the fairly recent at the time Jeff Johns' Batman Earth 1 comic line, which was meant to be a more grounded reimagining of the Caped Crusader than most of the comics had been in the past. It's a pretty nice suit and it looks pretty good here. The Sinestro Corps Batsuit is from when Batman briefly got a Yellow Lantern ring and got a Sinestro Corps costume. It's kind of a random pull, but Jeff Johns and his multicolor lanterns were hot shit in 2011, so it's not a shock they threw his suit in the game. The Dark Knight Returns suit is based on the famous Frank Miller comic line, The Dark Knight Returns, and looks pretty cool, especially on this bulky Batman that we have in Arkham City. Year 1 is another suit adapted from Frank Miller's Batman comics, this time the Year 1 storyline. Looks okay, but the eyes are a bit weird. Batman Incorporated suit is based on the suit Bruce wore when he traveled back in time to be revived following the events of Final Crisis. At the time, Dick Grayson was Batman, but that didn't last long before the New 52 happened and Dick went back to Nightwing and Bruce the sole Batman again, at which point he just started wearing a more traditional looking bat suit. This was the current suit during the production of this game, but the DC New 52 debuted just a few months before this game's launch, so that's probably why we got this relatively drop in the bucket suit rather than the New 52 suit, which would be used consistently up till Rebirth 5 years after this game came out. Catwoman also has a number of suits along with her original design that was set up for this game, which is inspired by her modern comic suits. We also had the Wii U exclusive armored suit, which is her primary suit in that game. This costume is horrendous. The next suit is the animated series suit, which I think translated better being based on her gray suit from the animated series. I like this suit, definitely looks better than the Batman equivalent, which is likely due to the more realistic female anatomy the animated series elected for the female characters. Long Halloween Catwoman suit is kind of a weird Catwoman suit. It looks cool, it's just a surprising pick, but I'm not opposed to it, I guess. It looks fine. Robin's suits include the default, which is similar to Tim Drake's Robin suit from the comics, but add a hood. It's an original design, but definitely feels very Robin-esque and tries to perhaps ground the suit slightly more than in the comics, which I enjoy. The animated series suit isn't actually based on Tim's suit from the show, but Dick's. Tim's suit would be damn near impossible to port over, so I get it. The Batman and Catwoman suits are also based on their Season 1 looks, so it fits that aesthetic more to have him look this way. Also, to make it more confusing, Dick's look from the animated series was based on Tim's look from the comics, so it's a Tim suit based on a Dick suit based on a Tim suit. Very confusing, but whatever. Looks pretty cool, I guess. The Red Robin suit originated as the suit Dick Grayson used in Kingdom Come, though this suit was probably added because it was the suit Tim wore for 3-ish years prior to the New 52 relaunch, which, as I mentioned, only launched mere months before this game. So this was the suit they ported for Tim, and it looks really solid. While Tim's Red Robin run was pretty meh, and really locked in as a Batman spin-off book rather than its own thing like the Robin run before it, the suit was still pretty iconic and one I absolutely loved, especially since Tim is the one that definitely followed Batman the closest in terms of detective skills and stuff. It makes sense he'd create a Batman-inspired Red Robin suit. I like this suit, it's kind of cool. Finally, we have Nightwing, who only has his base suit, which is a Arkhamized version of his standard suit. They didn't really think outside of the box on him since the suit is pretty easy to adapt over, with Nightwing's modern suit design being pretty iconic and also fitting of the world pretty well. Nightwing also gets an animated series suit. Notably, this is the one from The New Adventures of Batman and Robin, which was a sequel show to Batman the Animated Series that had ground-up redesigns for all characters, though this is probably due to the fact that the Batman the Animated Series proper never featured Nightwing, only the sequel show. A number of months after the game's initial release, in May of 2012, Batman Arkham City got a story expansion pack, Harley Quinn's Revenge, which is pretty cool in that it primarily stars Robin following the disappearance of Batman following Joker's death. Robin finds out that Harley Quinn, the grieving girlfriend of Joker, was naturally the cause of the disappearance of Batman, with her putting him in a pod that is slowly depleted of oxygen. It's a pretty classic comic book death trap. It's a nice story DLC, and it has a lot of cool locations, despite being a fairly brisk hour and a half approximately. But getting to play as Robin in the story is fun, and finally adds more lore to the Bat family, who were notably absent from the first game, bar Oracle. Along with this, there's also a new game plus that lets you pull your stats over, but is a bit trickier than the first playthrough. I decided to skip doing that for this playthrough of the game, but I did it a couple times back in the day, and it's fun having everything at your disposal from the start. It makes you kinda overpowered even with the slightly powered up enemies. Overall, Batman Arkham City, much like the first game, is very good, though I still think I prefer the first, surely because the Metroidvania stylings of the first over the open world game we have here. The world is still very detailed, and in some ways I think the gameplay was refined and expanded in different ways. The fact that they managed to put this out just 2 years after the first is incredible, and it is one of the strongest sequels to ever come out with such a small amount of turnaround time. The addition of some other playable characters was also fun, and playing as Nightwing, Robin, and Catwoman was pretty cool. The story doesn't overstay its welcome, and it has some fun moments to be had throughout the game. It was also even more the template for future installments of not only this game series, but also things like Spider-Man from Insomniac, the Shadow of Mordor games, and the combat became something of a standard, with games like Assassin's Creed briefly emulating the style for games like Assassin's Creed 3, in a way taking over the beat-em-up genre, till the Souls-like style would take over this style just a few years later with the burst in popularity of those games. The game landed in the 90s range on Metacritic, with the Wii U version falling a bit shorter at 85%. The game sold super well, selling over 6 million copies by February of 2012, though that number has surely ballooned, being frequently on sale more recently, and now with 3 unique ports, with the Return to Arkham port, the original port, and the Switch port, which are all unique, on top of the Game of the Year edition and more, seemingly probably has taken this 6 million figure to much, much higher. This game seems to be one of Warner Bros. Golden Goose to this day, and I'm sure they'll certainly do another report, remake, or whatever as years go on. Regardless, Warner Brothers didn't want to let the coals cool, so to speak, so with Rocksteady starting work on Arkham Knight, the true sequel to this game, Warner Interactive attempted to make a side game with Batman Arkham Origins, which would take place before the events of Arkham Asylum back when Batman was a newer vigilante. That game in itself would come out with a portable exclusive side game that naturally would be ported to consoles in Batman Arkham Blackgate, which is what we'll be looking at next for our Batman Arkham series in the near future.